Well, we'd love to keep seeing where you're coming from. Feel free to drop in the chat, but I'll go ahead and get us started. My name is Colin Groth. I'm the Executive Vice President at Strive Together. We're a national movement of place-based partnerships, many of whom are beginning to join the MBK network. And our movement believes that race, place, ethnicity, and income shouldn't predict a child's economic future. And we express that belief every day by supporting a national network of partners from 29 states. And so we're here today. One of our big beliefs, and one of the things I think we've seen happening across the My Brother's Keeper network, is that to really accelerate change, if we hold the belief that racism is a construct of prejudice plus power, then one of the ways that we can deconstruct racism is by actually shifting and sharing power in a way that creates new, more equitable systems. And so we're joined by leaders from across the country today who are contributing in a variety of different ways. Apologies for the sirens in the background. But who are also at different stages of developing a backbone team. One of the things that we've seen is that, backbone teams are really a critical accelerant to the work to accelerate systems change. And so in a moment, you'll get to hear from some folks working directly on the ground to do that work each and every day. We're also joined by my good friend, Herein Price, who works both at, has a lot of experience in the neighborhood level, and now is thinking about what does it really look like to drive systemic change through his new role at the William Julius Wilson Institute. So I'm going to give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and their work, and I will kick it to Carlisha to start us off.
Hello, everyone. I am Carlisha Bradley in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and serve as the Executive Director of Impact Tulsa. I run a collective impact organization that supports 21 school districts in Tulsa County and 9 post-secondary institutions. We're a Strive Together partner and backbone that has been in existence for almost 7 years. I came to this work through public education, having worked as a teacher and administrator, a charter school superintendent, and also currently serve on the Oklahoma State Board of Education. So I'm excited to share more about what we're doing in our emerging work with My Brother's Keeper here in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Love it. And over to you, Shelly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shelly Mendez. I am the Director of College Pathways here in San Antonio, Texas at UP Partnership. We are a collective impact organization and work with over 175 partners across our 4 system change networks that we have here. One of them is My Brother's Keeper San Antonio. The others is Diplomas, which is looking at Latinx success with a focus on Dreamers. Our Tomorrow Network, which is a youth action policy network. And the last one is Excel Beyond the Bell, which is really looking at that quality out of school time provider. And so all of them, we use this collective impact framework to really drive equity across all of our systems here in San Antonio.
Sonia, coming to you next.
Good afternoon, Colin. I also just had to close my window because I had sirens going crazy. My name is Sonia Anderson. I'm the president of Thrive Chicago in Chicago. We are a collective impact organization, part of the Strive Together network. And our work primarily focuses in 3 areas. In close partnership with the Obama Foundation, we are the foundation's Chicago partner for My Brother's Keeper. We have a body of work that focuses on opportunity youth, where we really lean in on education, training, and employment opportunities for 16 to 24-year-olds who are persistently either out of work or not pursuing post-secondary opportunities. And then we partner with Chicago Public Schools around a number of K-12 initiatives. I too come to this work with a public education background, starting off as a public school teacher in Mississippi, which is where I'm from. I spent about 10 years working in international development and global education, and then transitioned back to domestic education, working in philanthropy, early childhood, and K-12. And I am really excited about being here today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Herein, if you want to close us out.
Sure. Thanks, Colin. Herein Price, good to be with you all. I'm our Managing Director of External Engagement here at the Harlem Children's Zone. And along with our founder, Jeff Canada, I also serve as our lead for the William Julius Wilson Institute, which is a national hub we've set up now just a year and counting. And the idea is for us to be a resource for place-based, people-focused solutions, opening pathways to social and economic mobility nationwide. And we have the good pleasure of partnering with regional and neighborhood-based backbone organizations, including a couple of on the screen. So the UP partnership down in San Antonio has been an awesome partner, along with Thrive Chicago. So it's great to be with friends in the work today.
So first and foremost, we want to make sure that we're understanding a little bit about where you're coming from and who you are. So again, drop your location in the chat. Feel free to throw questions out. We're going to have time to really dig into audience questions. And I think we may actually have a couple polls. We're really interested to know what stage of the MBK framework your community is in. Do you see yourself in entry, emerging, systems change? And also a little bit about your geographic scope. Are you working at the neighborhood level, citywide, countywide? Are you coming from a more rural community? Let us know, and that way we can make sure that we're framing our content to meet your all's needs. So I want to start with Chelly and Carlisha, Chelly and Sonia, who have been at this for a few years now, thinking about both how to build a backbone to support regional Strive Together work, but also really this targeted work in supporting boys and young men of color. And I'm wondering if you can each talk a little bit about, like, when I say backbone, what even comes to mind for you? What does that mean? How do you structure that in your communities? But also, what have you learned from that experience, and what advice would you give to newer communities thinking about building a backbone team? And whoever would like.
Well, I'll start unless you want to flip a coin, Shelley. So I would say a couple of things. As you said, Colin, we've been doing this work in Chicago for a number of years, and I think we've learned a couple of really important lessons. I think the first one really focuses on this notion of building a big tent, right? So if you're in a place like Chicago, the ecosystem of nonprofits is quite large and quite diverse. I think increasingly, because of this particular moment in time that we are living in as a city and as a nation, there is a deepening understanding of some of the particular challenges and opportunities and experiences that boys and young men of color face. And lots of folks and lots of organizations are talking about this work. So part of what we try to do at Thrive Chicago as a collective impact organization and as a backbone organization is to really think about what's the universe of those players and how do we really make space at the table for all of them. Now, as we get deeper into our work, we sometimes bifurcate folks according to their particular sectors or their particular areas of interest or expertise. But we really want Thrive Chicago and this focus on boys and young men of color to feel like it's something that any number of groups can wrap themselves around and really start to engage in the work. And the other point I'll just make here before handing it to Shelley is, for us, that also really means focusing on both the grass tops and the grassroots, if you will. Right? I think so often in this work, folks either see themselves on one side of the divide or the other. And for us, we like to think of ourselves as the connective tissue between the two. Right? We have deep relationships in community because of our incredible talent and the folks that we bring into our organization who understand the needs of community, who share some of the lived experiences of the folks from the communities that we serve, and have deep relationships with nonprofits, with the faith community, with schools, et cetera. And we also, quite by design, have significant relationships with grass tops, policymakers, and other decision makers in our community. And we know that sometimes never the two shall meet. And so we really think of ourselves as the bridge and connective tissue to help lift up some of the voices of community members, but in a way that really, quite frankly, will shake loose some of the resources, some of the relationships, and some of the other needs that the grass tops are holding that can really have a significant impact in the communities that we care about.
I completely agree with those 2 points that you pointed out. I think it's a similar experience that we've seen here in San Antonio. We've been this backbone organization for a very long time and have housed My Brother's Keeper from the beginning in 2014. And so we've seen it have a very long stretch where you had lots of political will, lots of resources. We've also seen it when there was no political will and no resources. And along that time, we know that the partners who can stay at the room and deal with that level of just influx that happens are typically your bigger organizations, are typically your organizations who have more power and have more access to resources, right? But how do you make sure still that those who are most impacted, so our boys and young men of color, have a seat at that table consistently? As well as how do you make sure the partners who maybe are the 10-person community-based organization who we know is doing the work and has been doing the work but hasn't been resourced the same, also still has equal opportunity to be engaged in that community space. For us, one of the things that we have realized is really having clear tools that help people see their role in this work has allowed for us to be able to keep people engaged. And so we have one tool that we call an agreement. And within that agreement, it lays clearly out who is the backbone and what is the backbone supposed to do in a bi-directional relationship that allows for us to be able to engage in this partnership, as well as like, how do you align to this work? We want to make sure that not only the policymakers and the superintendents are like, yes, of course, post-secondary attainment is important. What is our nonprofit's role? What is our government role and philanthropy role in business? And so that really helps us all say, if this is our shared goal, maybe I'm the one doing the policy review, but this school district is the one sharing the data, or this nonprofit is actually providing the technical assistance. And so having that agreement laid out to where folks truly can always go back to what is keeping us on track? What are we trying to move? What are we trying to do? And how do I see myself in this? At the same time, making a governance structure that allows from the ground up to really be the ones driving the strategies with the political will supported from the top, but really making sure that those on the ground are setting the agenda.
I'm hearing a lot about this connective tissue, building and maintaining political will, clarifying roles, tools for partners, and thinking about how do you actually like get folks into agreement, and I mean that literally in like written agreement. Are there other key roles that you think about when you think about the work, particularly for boys and young men of color in your backbone teams?
One of the things I'll just add is, we've had to be really, really thoughtful about, I'm just building on Shelley's point a little bit and also responding to your question, Colin, really thoughtful about what is ours to do and what is someone else's to do. I say this all the time. I just got through saying it earlier today. Having a strategic vision means being comfortable saying no, right? And that doesn't mean, no, we don't care about these issues. It means, no, this isn't in our wheelhouse, but as a backbone organization, we're really clear that our role is to be that connective tissue, right? So to say Thrive Chicago does not do X, pick a direct service activity, any direct service activity, but we work in partnership and collaboration with any number of nonprofits. With our MBK work, we have an action team that meets on a regular basis. It comprises a constellation of over 90 nonprofits from throughout the city that work at all different levels, but all of them have a deep focus on boys and young men of color. So depending on what the issue is, what the opportunity or the challenge is, it's Thrive's role as a backbone organization to say, well, we don't do that, but our partners, A, B, and C do. So let us articulate what the opportunity is and help connect the right people to the right resources and the right groups. And for us, figuring out that distinction has been sometimes easier said than done, but I think it's really, really, really important for any organization because we all know that mission creep is real. And if you're not careful, you'll end up way over here when you started off, somewhere else. So I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways for us. And that point around building a big tent, in the context of our action team work, no matter which partner we look at, no matter which partner we reach out to, we know that at the core, there's a fundamental commitment to boys and young men of color. And from that point on, it's just a matter of matching, the right organization with the right set of needs.
I love that. Know when to say no. It's really important, especially depending on the capacity of your backbone. Like, you don't need to do all of the things to be my brother's keepers. What I find myself often telling folks, because they're always like, well, we can do more. We could do more, but what's the level of impact we're going to be able to create if we stretch ourselves too thin? So I really love that point. The additional point that I want to make is I think the backbone owes it to community to make sure that they're driving strategies, which means we have to be neutral on a lot of things. And we have to take a step back and say, what is moving them forward? What we do not ever have to be neutral on is racial equity and around equity for all. So being really inclusive of what does it look like for LGBTQ youth? What does it look like for women and girls as well? What does it look like in knowing how to disaggregate economic status, all of those pieces, so we can actively be making sure that our partners are coming to the day the best informed. And so I just wanted to make sure that pin was there because that is something we've seen over the multiple years that I've been in this role, where often a lot of times that's where I'm saying no, is where we have someone who's clearly not in alignment with that equitable piece. And so even if you're coming to the table with a lot of resources, if you don't have equity at the center, I don't think it's a good partnership here. So I just wanted to make sure it's okay to tell a partner that doesn't align there no.
Incredibly helpful. And I heard like so many of the elements of the MBK framework already, right? Like around collaboration, equity, vision, systems change, right? Like all of this sustainability around mission creep, right? So much of the work of the backbone team connected to these key elements. I'm going to come over to you, Carlisha, because while Impact Tulsa, I know, has been around for some time, the work to really get targeted in the My Brother's Keeper work is new and I think emerging. So tell us a little bit about how you're approaching that. What does it mean for your team, and how are you thinking about structuring the work moving forward?
Great, Colin, thanks. I am definitely excited about taking on this charge and Impact Tulsa serving as the backbone function for My Brother's Keeper here in our community. I think about the years of work that has led us to this point, and one thing that is a great selling point for our collective impact organization is our racial equity driven data strategy. And so Impact Tulsa, a couple of years ago, in partnership with our largest school district, Tulsa Public Schools, developed the Child Equity Index that's looking at neighborhood factors and how those are carried in a student's backpack to school to impact academic success. And so we're drilling down to 5 different neighborhood domains, looking through census tract data, and really able to serve as a data hub to influence strategy, whether it's in the city and we're working on internet access during COVID and while school was remote, or we're able to influence strategy on where funding is allocated for students and their needs in the school system. So we've done a lot of work in that space of being a data intermediary, and this initiative that is focused on the trajectory of boys and young men of color allows for us to take that data and mobilize for systemic change. And so I really view oftentimes our community in Tulsa, especially as we look at just next week, we're commemorating 100 years since the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And many of the inequities that we're continuing to see have compounded over years. From the Child Equity Index, it mirrors the Opportunity Atlas and seeing where there is just a dearth of opportunity, resources, food deserts in our city. It's at a point to where we have several philanthropic investments and we're program rich, but really struggling with those deep rooted policies and the policy change to address those inequities. And so as we approach MBK and this opportunity to be a site, we're number one, digging deeply into the data that we're already mobilizing stakeholders around. Secondly, we're thinking about deeply and have been in conversation. Shelley has been a huge resource to our Impact Tulsa team about how do we center the voices of youth from the beginning. So as we already have a ton of quantitative data, we are beginning this process with focus groups with boys and young men of color to couple that in our original convening alongside. So the lived experience with the quantitative data to tell that story and to have youth in that space to tell their own stories. And lastly, similar to what Sonia was mentioning, how do we serve as that connective tissue of the grassroots and the grass tops? A lot of our energy has been focused in building those key relationships with systems leaders and bringing members on our team that are deeply connected to the community and building up this muscle and the work to shift power resources back to boys and young men of color through this work with Impact Tulsa. So we're excited. I'm excited to be in this space with you guys and continuing to learn even during this panel as we embark upon this work.
Love it. And I want to make sure I get Hailing's voice in here. And Hailing, we've talked a lot about, for a myriad of regional partnerships, and we've seen this certainly across Strive Together. Often the focus becomes about kind of this systemic change. And Carlos, you were talking about policy shifts and some of these.
Yeah.
And many have struggled with thinking about what does the work look like at the neighborhood level. And so I'm curious, like, what's your take on the similarities and the distinctions that need to be thought about between regional and neighborhood work as it relates to backbones?
Sure. Thank you, Colin. I love the thread I'm hearing about the connective tissue, and I want to sort of stay on that for a moment. So one thing that occurs to me is we've got a lot of overlap in the communities that we seek to support. So we've got regional network-based work and neighborhood-based work. And not too long ago, I was having a conversation with Chelly's colleague, Ryan, about how important it will be for us to build out this idea of aligned contributions at those different layers of the ecosystem, because we're solving for the same issues fundamentally, but we sit in different vantage points. So basically, how do we get in where we fit in to make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes, but actually operating in a more complementary way? So I don't really see tension as much as I see a lot of complementarity between what's happening on the regional and the neighborhood level. So to sort of circle back on the question you asked, Colin, I think when you look at the network-based work and you're looking at systems, it is very much the policy work. And I would say more broadly, the set of sort of conditions you need to shift in order for these root challenges to be changing. So that may be adjacent systems beyond your core cradle to career focus, thinking about things like transportation, housing, infrastructure, and how you really set that container at the regional and citywide level so that folks doing the good work on the neighborhood level are empowered to really push in community with the folks that they want to serve. But I think it has to be both and. And lately, maybe this is just the space time in the intermediary world, I hear a lot about systems versus programs, or this sort of false choice that it's one or the other. And I think in some circles you're in, at least again, the circles I'm in, you get the sense that systems change. To some people feel sort of pie in the sky or hand wavy. And then to others, the program piece actually feels sort of like a Band-Aid, and folks are dismissive of the execution work that's actually required to move the needle. And the truth is, obviously, you need all of that to make this move forward. And I think the onus is on us, and particularly on backbone leaders across these networks, to get really crisp on what hat they wear in that process and what do I own. So if we have this kind of aligned contributions set of understandings, it's like, okay, so maybe me on the neighborhood level, I'm really accountable to this population in this way. But I'm really being clear about how that sort of folds up into what's happening on the regional level. And the last piece I'll say, as we think about just sort of catchment areas and geography, is that we can't let the most vulnerable get lost in the averages. And I think oftentimes we've pushed against, politically and just sort of locally in politics about this narrative of a rising tide lifting all boats. That is not how we address equity in any frame in our community. So for us to really get clear on what it looks like, for me, a great resource is that idea of targeted universalism that Angela Gulper-Blackwell and our colleagues at PolicyLink think about, but really solving for the most vulnerable, which are our Black and brown young folks in our communities. I know this is a conversation about men, but we would want to erase the voices of young women who are often sort of addressing these intersectional challenges. And if we're really thinking about how to cut to the core of those issues, then over time, we're going to be solving for everyone in those communities. So I think the risk on erasing the neighborhood voice and the regional focus is that, again, if we revert to the averages, we're not actually thinking about who is sort of receiving the most harm and really struggling under marginalization with these systems that weren't designed to serve us. So we need to get really clear on how to make those connections sharper.
I saw a lot of nodding heads. Yeah, I was going to say, open it up to the group, Sonia.
Yeah, I want to respond to the point around systems in particular. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think we have to talk about systems. This notion of the false dichotomy between programs and systems, I say all the time, like we can all keep ourselves really, really busy with a lot of different programs and a lot of activities. And at the end of the day, not see any kind of market systems change at scale, right? And so we have to be having those two conversations in parallel. I am very clear in my mind, there is no foundation that's big enough. There is no nonprofit sector that is big enough to replace the public sector. Government has a role and a responsibility, and the work that we do helps either catalyze some of those movements or shore up some of those movements, but it cannot supplant that responsibility. And so from the very beginning, we have to be thinking about the impact of systems. Going back to that point I made earlier about building a big tent, part of our big tent right from the jump is our public sector and systems player. So we partner with CPS right at the table. CPS members come to our MBK action team meetings and participate actively. We partner with the Department for Family and Children's Services. We partner with institutions of higher education. We partner with large-scale charter school networks in our community because we know that the work that we are launching, piloting, catalyzing has to feed into this larger systems framework so that one day when we all step away from the table, because hopefully we will have worked ourselves out of a job, all that good work continues to last and stand.
And curious, just to build on this for a moment, we can't program your way to systems change. I also know, it's really hard to deliver services and supports if you're only doing systems work and not actually thinking about programmatic delivery. So hearing this thread of both and, Also curious, for those of you in community, how do you think about and how do you interface with neighborhood groups and what's the sort of role of the backbone team, and as Haling was talking about, kind of working at the different levels of the ecosystem?
So yeah, I think the different levels of ecosystem that a contribution comes in really, really well. And so what I see a lot of times happen is we have amazing programs who come to the table and say, this is what I'm going to do. And I say, okay, what gets in the way of your success, right? What is the thing that if it was fixed, all of the young people that you are serving would be successful? And so we do lots of deep root cause analysis, the 5 whys, trying to really dive in and understand what's the root cause behind it. And so then how do I couple you with a partner who maybe has identified the deep root cause and you all are working together? So going back to that connectivity is a lot of times people do have a piece of what success and system change looks like, but not one of us can complete it on our own. And so really being that connector, helping putting the puzzle pieces together to where that aligned contribution can happen, I think is probably the most crucial piece that we play as a backbone here, is we're able to see all of those dots that maybe someone who's in the program space doesn't see because they're in the program. They need to be doing that direct service work. And it's crucial to changing the way that young men of color feel about themselves. And then we also have the policymaker who I need them at the state right now. We are in legislative session here in Texas, and they have our policy agenda, and they're saying, okay, well, 31 of MBKSA's partners are saying that these are important things. I can't bring all of my direct service agencies here right now because I'm the policymaker. I'm the one here helping make sure we reinforce at the policy level what needs to shift in order to create that access. So aligned contributions is a wonderful framework.
So, and for those that definitely look up the Theory of Aligned Contributions, is an incredible resource and we're happy to share and make, maybe we can send some links out after, but definitely something we think a lot about across the network. And so shouts out to, Jolie Bain-Pillsbury and Raj and all the folks that have worked on so much of that for so long. Also, John Powell shouts out for Targeted Universalism and some of the other work there. I'm curious, Carlisha, you were talking a lot about, even in the sort of taking this work on from the early stages, really the importance of grounding in data. And one of the roles of the partnership being, how are you starting with some of the data that you have on hand? I wonder if you could take us through that a little bit more and talk both about sort of what are the quantitative data sets you're thinking about, and also how are you thinking about qualitative data in the launch of this work?
Question. So I was mentioning earlier a bit about the Child Equity Index and what that resource gives us access to. It's 40 different indicators. We're looking at student level factors, neighborhood health, neighborhood socioeconomic status, neighborhood pride and custodianship, neighborhood access. So looking at this all the way across our Tulsa County, overlaying that with academic outcomes for students in our largest district that serves the largest population of young men of color. And so we have rich data sets and data sharing agreements, whether that's with our post-secondary institutions, also looking at employment, and anything that you could think of. The Impact Tulsa team is keenly disaggregating that data, and it is readily available to us in several different ways. But when I think about this initiative, it's easy, and even as we've begun the work for individuals in the community to say, oh, this is it. This is what you need to focus on. This is the thing, absent of the voice and the lived experience of young men of color to say, this is the root cause. Oftentimes systems leaders can jump into diagnosing a challenge based on the quantitative results without taking that pause to think about, what is the lived experience of individuals in our community. And I think that for our context, specifically in Tulsa, over the years, trust has increasingly been broken with the prescriptive methods of how we're going to address the challenges based on the quantitative data versus our stories and experiences and some of the collective trauma that has been had by people of color in our city. So we are choosing to center these conversations on young men of color in our early stages and men in our community, holding those listening sessions and focus groups and building the first table with the community. It has not come without challenge of navigating that space, especially, with those individuals, as Shelley was mentioning, the organizations that are larger, the nonprofits that are there and that have more decision-making power, to really hold space to shift power back to the community in this effort and staying true to that in the process. So being able to look at examples of what is happening in San Antonio, what is happening in Chicago, really gives us inspiration and grounding to lead this work here in Tulsa.
Just pausing to see if either from the national perspective or from your other communities. Yep.
Well, the one thing I was going to say, just thinking about the importance of data, I think it's so easy to compartmentalize data and think about it in a very sort of narrow way and with a narrow set of uses. One of the things that we're doing at Thrive Chicago is looking at some qualitative data that we collected from boys and young men of color. And through these conversations, we were able to surface a whole set of recommendations that came directly from the mouths of the population that we purport to serve. And we're using that data not only to inform the strategy under the MBK body of work, but actually saying to ourselves, if we, Thrive, are an organization that is committed to equity and equity outcomes, and that's committed to serving boys and young men of color as an organization, then why are we only looking at that rich, robust, qualitative data in this side of the house? Shouldn't it actually infuse everything that we say and do? And so increasingly, as we go through our own strategic pivot or evolution at Thrive, we're taking that data, we're building out a whole set of programs and focus on systems change under the auspices of the MBK work, but also saying these same issues and concerns and opportunities and challenge also inform boys and young men of color who are opportunity youth, also inform boys and young men of color who are, sitting squarely every day in our public schools. So let's start to break down some of those artificial silos within our own organization and really move this focus on boys and young men of color, using the data, using the recommendations that came from their own mouths, and use that to inform everything that we do as an organization.
Another piece, I really appreciate that point that Sonia just raised, to go deeper on this idea of like how we leverage the right data and where it's coming from, just actually interrogating our mental models about what constitutes valid data. And I think oftentimes our funders and policymakers are driving us to think about the most quantitative sort of measurable RCT proven kinds of interventions. And we know here in Harlem, that's not going to tell a fraction of the story we need to convey the incredible results we have over a generation of evidence across the 97 blocks that we serve here. And as I'm thinking about how we at the Institute continue to support others, one of the things that I've been telling leaders around the country, or at least offering, is that to tell a story, the data is going to be a great tool, but not if it's not embedded in a broader narrative about the kind of change that you're doing. And that means these are stories you want to craft in partnership with the folks you serve, elevating and amplifying the voices of constituents, children and families, the young men who you're serving through this MBK work. So I just think it's on us to not only lift that work up, but to push the folks across the table to say, hey, here's our annual report. You're going to see some stuff in here that may fit your sort of schema for what this data is supposed to look like. And you might get some talking points, some narratives, some storytelling that's going to paint a three-dimensional picture. And it's really important we take that chunk seriously as well.
I think what I'll add around the data collection piece is really what I heard at the end of like how you can use it. And I also think it's about how do we shift our partners to being more like young people centered and letting them become the decision makers. So creating an infrastructure that allows for them to also build their capacity for young people to be involved. And what I will say is within our network, we've done a few different options on how to make sure young people become decision makers. The spot where we're currently at is we've asked our higher education partners to appoint 2 liaisons to a standing committee around young men of color who work with our policy leaders. And, they are responsible for stipending them, and they are responsible for supporting and, getting them to Zoom or to wherever it may be at this current time, but supporting that process. That way it's also embedded in our partner structures, and they have been able to interact with their president then and share their stories more directly and different things like that. So really thinking through what's the partners infrastructure to also center this so we can all be engaging in this movement for with young people. I think the second thing that I would name, Carlisha, please give me that assessment. That's all I wanted to make sure I didn't forget there. It sounds like an amazing one. And I think just thinking through different ways that we look at data is really crucial. And I love how I heard that, innovative way. And Sonia, I love y'all's recommendations. I have that book literally in my living room space. It's a good one.
Well, maybe sticking with the data theme for a second, I see our first question from Mark is actually around, and I think, Sonia, this is going back a little bit to your big tent idea, but could you talk a little bit about some of the indicators for bifurcating that big tent into subgroups? You know, are you thinking about that by sector, by location, by age group served, open to all? First question coming in, and also if you have additional questions, be sure to throw them in the Q&A so we can get your voices in here. So how are you all thinking about that bifurcation or holding the big tent and thinking about some of the targeted engagement?
Well, I'll start since I use the big tent metaphor. I think it's all those things that you just said, right? So a lot of our work is neighborhood focused, and we know that, you know, in Chicago we often talk about the South Side or the West Side, but those mean, you know, within each one of those broad categories, communities that have their own particular sets of needs and experiences. And so we want to be really thoughtful and careful about how we sort of glom all those things together. So we look at some of the indicators that you just named. In particular here at the moment, there is a big move in philanthropy, in corporate philanthropy from the city of Chicago. There's been a huge influx of resources into South and West Side communities. And so one of the internal conversations that we're having right now is, as Thrive thinks about where it really wants to direct its efforts, do we go where everyone else is going, right? So in these, a handful of communities that have received a tremendous amount of attention and resources, and is there an opportunity for Thrive to come in as another player and reinforce the good works that are already happening there? Or is there an argument to be made for going to those other neighborhoods that are perhaps a little more neglected, right? Because folks aren't thinking about them. And we are at this very moment having that internal conversation and looking at some of the key indicators around education, around crime, around employment outcomes, around existing public and private sector investments, around, quite frankly, where we have relationships, around politics, that sort of squishy, indefinable yet very important thing that's called politics, both lowercase p and uppercase p, to help us as an organization decide where we should really start to direct our attention and efforts over the next few months and years.
Another question coming in, sticking with the data theme. How to ensure shared measurement across multiple work groups? So health, education, workforce, public safety. Is that sharing just to the steering committee or across all work groups?
It depends on the data agreements. So we try as much as possible for our to be shared across the whole network. However, we understand sometimes as we're working through those metrics, if it's an early initiative that's coming out, like sometimes we need time to clean it up because people collect data drastically differently. Even if you say, I want to know about enrollment for boys and young men of color, I'll still get 20 different types of data sets because every institution at the end of the day is different and their definition of enrollment is different. So I would say it depends on the data agreement and also like what phase you're in data collection. You have to build trust. And so people it's a very vulnerable space to be in, to share my data with you. And maybe I actually shared the wrong thing. And the last thing we want to do is put out incorrect data. So I would say give some grace for people to build that relationship, be trusting with you, be trusting with your partners that like, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to figure it out. And then when y'all are ready, you know, of course, share as broadly as you can and through a mutual agreement.
Just making space if others want to jump in on this one.
I think feedback loops are really important in this process because we all have our unique organizational culture around data. So it's one thing to have a system where, you know, agreements providing, you can actually upload all the stuff as Scrub, but then how you actually communicate that, how it's leveraged day to day, I think will vary a lot in partnerships where you've got different sets of actors. So actually aligning upfront about how the tools will be used, if you're scrubbing, what the sort of expectations are, even around the tactical things like timing, but really getting on the same page, because I found that you get a pretty broad range of just how this shows up from one organization to another.
And although for us, I mean, this will be a new network. In previous networks, we do have data sharing agreements where it is for that working group as much as possible at the end of that test of change or as we continue to grow in the initiative. Our goal is to make that public across our partners to share those best practices and learnings. But I agree with Shelley, you know, this work moves at the speed of trust and building those relationships and also in the mission and in the work and what the outcomes are that you're driving towards to build that sense of shared accountability as we're all working towards improving those measures across the board.
And I should have shout out to Ray for asking that question. Von Dale has one. And Chelly, you were talking a lot about this in terms of the, you know, the centering youth voice. But curious for all of you, what recruiting strategies are you using to get more boys and young men of color at the decision table? And how do you ensure that voices are being heard and respected as a backbone to systems change?
I'll jump in and offer one example in our Opportunity Youth portfolio. Again, it's Opportunity Youth, but it's primarily boys and girls of color. We've recently established a youth advisory board. So alongside this action team that's made up of representatives from the various nonprofits that focus in this sector, we know that in the absence of including young people, that we're missing an opportunity and we're just reinforcing an organizational blind spot that of course we don't want to do. And so we recently constituted this youth advisory board. They meet on a weekly basis. They bring real questions, real challenges, and more important, I think, give us real pushes as the adults in the room to really bring that authentic voice and perspective, and quite frankly, help us come up with a set of solutions and opportunities that we wouldn't otherwise think about. At the same time, you know, I always think about both the give and the get. So we're getting all of this rich information and contribution and resources for them. We have to ask ourselves, what are we giving them? And so part of what we are offering through their participation is this opportunity, this professional development opportunity to learn what it means to be part of this collective, to learn about, you know, what it means to articulate issues and concerns and ideas around a collective table. We're having conversations about introducing them to members of our board so that they really understand, you know, a variety of professional trajectories and really have a sense of what the possibilities are. I say all the time when we talk about boys and young men of color or girls for that matter, we often talk about them having jobs, right? But I don't have a job. You don't have a job. I have a career. Right? I have a profession. And so as we think about sort of unpacking that black box and demystifying that trajectory, we want to really own our role in providing that kind of opportunity and support to young people in the same way that they so willingly give of their time and perspective and expertise to us.
I agree. Similar to Sonia, we have a youth advisory team that we have assembled as well. As we work with partner organizations or districts, we are very much so centering ourselves in that process of being advocates for other organizations doing the same. Where are they at the strategic planning table? Not just the subcommittee, but actually at the table. And what does it mean for their lived experiences to be heard and to influence the strategic priorities of our organizational partners, but also of our own work. In addition to giving them the experience and the exposure, we also believe in compensating young men of color and youth for their time. We're compensated to show up at the Action Network meetings, so this is part of our job. And oftentimes we think about community members coming into the space, and especially youth, offering so much to us. We too offer back compensation for the value that they bring into the spaces and set aside a part of our budget to ensure that we're able to do that at the same level as we would any other adult engaging in that space.
And an anonymous question coming in. When speaking about data and the narrative surrounding data, and I heard a little bit of this from you all in terms of like the weaponization of data or you know, the dangers of not using an asset-based approach. How are you all on the panel, including, as it moves on me, how are you all on the panel including the workers on the ground to tell the narrative around data, to paint a clearer picture for funders?
One of the pieces that I think is crucial on any network that you're supporting is, yes, those most impacted have to be at the table and have to be asked. I also think a lot of times we don't ask them in survey design mode. Like we say, yes, we want to go to them and we want their qualitative insights, but like, did we ask them how they even want to be asked a question is another way to think about it. And there's actually a podcast with FSG that just came out maybe a month ago, and it was around Indigenous reclaiming data. And I thought it was just such a beautiful podcast and around, who asked the question. Is it someone who comes from that lived experience and is helping you draft it? Is it who's helping you get the survey out there if you don't look like the person who's asking for that survey to be collected? I mean, there's so many ways to really thinking about reclaiming data. And I know, like in one of our work group spaces, we had a restorative justice survey that was going out, and one of my work group members had to pause me and say, hang on a second, who designed the survey tool? Right? And we're like, well, the work group member said. He said, right, but the broader community didn't. So did we check with the broader community? And I'm like, very important step. Like, yes, we're the ones who are able to be in this space and draft it, but how do we also create a checkpoint for those other organizations to feed it through and make sure that we're asking the right questions? And so it was an important checkpoint that I hadn't thought of before, but really thinking through who designs it, who approves what data is collected, to know that it is what needed to be collected, especially on a restorative justice survey, which should always be grounded in the First Nations people. And so making sure we were touching base there was crucial.
And a quick question. I see this session is being recorded. I believe folks will have access to this. People saying great discussion and want to be able to share this with their stakeholders. One question I'm curious, because I've heard this term come up multiple times, and everybody can play here, but I heard policy across a number of your comments, and I'm curious. Policy can be a touchy subject. I'll say in our network, at least what we saw in the early years was, many of the partnerships said they were going to, stay away from policy in some ways in the early years. I think some of it was about developing trust, and I heard a lot about the trust around data. But more and more, we're seeing partnerships all across the country really taking on policy in pretty profound ways. So I'm curious for your all's take, what is the role of the backbone as it relates to policy change? And are there places you will go and won't go as it relates to that?
Great question. I'll jump in. As I was one who mentioned that this is a space that we are interested in going deeper in, I think that often it is surfaced as a need from the community. We in Tulsa don't necessarily have a policy arm. There's an organization, but in terms of mobilizing groups and individuals, especially around public education outcomes, to drive towards advocacy efforts for policy change, that does not exist in our community. We're absent of that. And as an organization that's always looked at as having the data and really being able to get together individuals who might share different ideologies, but can be grounded in not only the data, but the lived experiences of community, we have found a great space in being a convener and want to take a step further in mobilizing individuals to drive towards that larger, more sustainable policy change. So for us, as we enter into that space, I think that we're in a position of going deeper into our strategic plan, defining what are those non-negotiables in our policy agenda as Impact Tulsa, to not be moved by whether it's someone who is affiliated with our work or a part of one of the networks, really being rooted in what must be true for Impact Tulsa to push forward in an equitable policy agenda, and especially for our work with MBK, that advances and impacts positively the lives of boys and young men of color. So we have to do the internal work to be prepared to bring in others to be a part of that journey with us.
Build on to that point. I think in Chicago, we're doing exactly the same thing. So Thrive Chicago is not a policy organization. We're not an advocacy organization. And when we have started to look in those categories, it's been because it's very explicitly linked to a body of work that we are doing. So for example, under the auspices of our MBK, we're doing quite a lot in the space around creating a pipeline for more male teachers of color to enter the classroom. As part and parcel of that work, we've discovered a couple of things. Number one, for example, in the state of Illinois, there's a pot of money that can be used to support post-secondary educational pursuits for young folks who want to pursue a career in education. That pot of money is often underutilized and then reabsorbed back into government because there are not enough teachers in training, teacher wannabes, right, who are in the pipeline. Similarly, we understand that because of some ACT, SAT requirements, there are some barriers to high schoolers receiving course credit that can then be applied into their post-secondary pursuits, right? And so again, as we're thinking about how do we build and bolster a pipeline of Black and brown young men to enter the educational profession, we are also becoming aware of these policy barriers that have these unintended, presumably unintended consequences, right? That work to the disservice of the very thing that we are trying to promote. So in those instances, we are partnering with an organization that does actually focus on policy at the state level and saying, hey, here are these things that we're surfacing in the context of what is within our scope. We want to bring that to your attention because that's within your scope, and think about how do we work in tandem to actually make changes so that on the programmatic level, we can do what we want to do and see the kind of outcomes that we want to see. And it just kind of goes back to that first point that I made about A, staying in your lane, knowing what is your lane and staying in it, but then B, this notion that we can't and don't have to be all things to all people. What we can and should do is have a constellation of partners, right, that we can tap into and engage to help move the agenda forward in ways that may not necessarily be appropriate for us.
What I love about that is you're sharing, like, you're creating the on-ramps for them too. Is a lot of times people, I do think, want to do a lot of good and have no idea how. And so a lot of times if you can even just carve out, like, here are some key policy themes that align with our work groups. We're not telling you have to do one of them, but just so you're aware, right? Giving them the right communication tool around policy goes back to my, like, make sure you're giving them a tool that they can use. And so how we built our agenda, it was very broad, and it could have been used at the local, state, county level. I mean, there was multiple ways, but the same overarching theme was, you know, how to create supportive services for boys and young men of color. And then there was key examples of, like, policy movements that could happen, or, you know, responding to COVID and key kind of policy themes again. And so you do that because then they could say, oh, wait, I'm higher ed. That's what that actually means for me. I'm an ISD. That's what that means for me. And so giving them those on-ramps. And then by the time we built that right around a year ago almost, by the time we got to legislation this current year, it was easy for us to say, okay, here's this bill that made it on the agenda item. That's how it fits here. This is what we support. Or this is what does not align, and we need to be very clear, we do not align with this bill. And giving them that language, they were able to say, okay, this is how I go and advocate. As a backbone, we didn't go and do any of that advocacy just based off of the restrictions that we have, because again, we're not a policy org, right? But it was able to give our partners that pathway who can do more policy and advocacy to say, here's my guide for boys and young men of color. This is how I tap into this specific policy.
And I know, Hailing, you've thought a lot about this, and there's a systems change. I always hear resonates so much with folks, and I know you're a big contributor to that. But any policy closing thoughts before we have one last question, and then I'm going to ask each of you to give one piece of advice as your parting shot.
Sure. So I just plus one to this notion of infrastructure. So most, if not all, the backbones I've encountered have not set up 501c4. So although this work is inherently political, there are restrictions we have. So this idea of providing on-ramps or infrastructure to make sure that voices are actually informing the policymaking process is different from taking sort of a capital P political stand. And I think we do have a responsibility to set folks up to have their voice represented in that process. And yes, on the systems change work, and I heard the earlier shout out to my colleagues at FSG, where I spent some good years thinking about how to support efforts like this around the country. It relates to this notion of mental models that came up earlier for me. So an example that we pulled from was thinking about the Affordable Care Act, right? So a signature policy win that didn't fundamentally change most folks' perspectives across the country about, like, healthcare as a universal right or versus sort of the sum of your choices. So when you think about the staying power of a policy win, you also need to think about the difficult work of the hearts and minds in the process, frankly. And if we get that sort of legislative victory that may expire after 2 years and we're dealing with a different legislature who hasn't actually been influenced in the long run, we're looking at shorter term solutions. So how to sort of nest these policy initiatives in the broader effort of what you might call narrative change, I think is key for sustainability.
Love it. Last question. Anyone a best practice around compensating young people? For example, putting 20% of what is earned into emergency savings. Anyone have any best practices here? If not, we might be learning from you.
Do it.
Learning.
Do it. But also, I love that idea.
Yeah, I was just going to say the best practice is make sure you're dedicating a staff role to it, dedicate funding to it, whatever it may look like. I think to ask people to do multiple roles is never a good idea in an organization. It'd be great if you had just one person who could say, I'm dedicated to thinking about how us as an organization embeds young people and their families and all of the broader community into this space. I think that is I don't know if it's a best practice, but that is my practice around just workforce in general, is like, we don't need to wear multiple hats. We could just let people be experts in something.
Well, thank you to the panelists. This has been an incredible conversation. I feel like I learned something from this group every time I get to connect. In our last minute, I would just give everyone an opportunity, tweet length. If you had one piece of advice for somebody thinking about, building a backbone to support this work, what would it be?
Back to the two words that I think became a refrain: aligned contributions. I'll also take this time to shout out the chat because y'all took it to church. I have had an opportunity to do a bunch of these in COVID. Never have I felt like a whole village was behind us in the conversation. So absent the sort of arm's length interaction, I just really appreciate the energy. I'm sure this is the energy you all bring to your work every day, and I'm grateful for the exchange.
Missed it. I have y'all on full screen, so I don't even know where the chat box is. So I'm gonna have to get there before I
That
sign.
was lit. You got to grab the recording.
Okay. I would just jump in here. Yes, to what you just shared. And again, that governance structure that allows the ground up to really be the drivers is what I would spend most of my time thinking on.
Agreed. I would say my tweetable will be build with community.
And I would say clearly define your North Star, but build a galaxy of other stars to shine with you.
Is dropping the mic at the end.
Yeah, on that note, thank you all. Incredible conversation. Thank you to everyone on the call for all of the incredible work that you are doing. And we look forward to seeing you in another session.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate y'all.
Pleasure.